Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for our first hearing of the 112th Congress. I can't think of a more appropriate subject to begin our oversight than a discussion of the Department of Defense's top-line budget expectations. The manner in which Secretary Gates is bringing fiscal discipline to the department and his proposals for finding efficiencies to reinvest in much-needed modernization and operations. Before we get started, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our new leadership team. In adopting the committee rules last week, the committee reorganized the jurisdictions of the subcommittees to align with military missions rather than individual military departments. Our new subcommittees and leadership teams are Emerging Threats and Capabilities, Chairman Mac Thornberry, Ranking Member James Langevin. For Military Personnel, Chairman Joe Wilson, Ranking Member Susan Davis. For Oversight and Investigations, Chairman Rob Whitman, Ranking Member Jim Cooper. For Readiness, Chairman Randy Forbes and Ranking Member Madeline Bordallo. For Sea Power and Projection Forces, Chairman Todd Aiken, Ranking Member Mike McIntyre. For Strategic Forces, Chairman Mike Turner and Ranking Member Loretta Sanchez. And last but not least, for Tactical Air and Land Forces, Chairman Roscoe Bartlett and Ranking Member Sylvester Reyes. I couldn't be more pleased about the selection of these members for our leadership team for the 112th Congress and appreciate the great depth and breadth of experience that they each bring to the table. I'm confident that we'll have a productive and purposeful year, and I look forward to working with each of them. As we get this new session started, there are a few administrative issues that I'd like to reiterate. First, questioning will occur in regular order by seniority of those present before the gavel, and then by order in which members arrive. That's how we will proceed today. There will be some hearings where we will vary from that. We'll explain it as we go through. Second, there will be strict enforcement of the 5-minute rule. Finally, to minimize obstruction of the walkways, only members and committee staff are permitted on the dais during the hearing. Thank you for your cooperation, and let's get started. In September, we held a preliminary hearing on the Department's Efficiencies initiative. At that time, I expressed concern about the lack of information that we'd been provided. I remain dismayed, despite repeated assurances from the Department about an interest to work together on these issues, that we've seen little change in the Department's willingness to share information. Now, let me be clear on this. I agree with Secretary Gates that we must scrutinize defense programs to ensure that we're getting the most bang for our buck and concentrating our limited resources on the highest priority programs. I support initiatives focused on reducing waste, streamlining operations, and eliminating redundancies across all enterprises. However, I will not support initiatives that will leave our military less capable and less ready to fight. And make no mistake about it, we stand at a critical juncture in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. As we draw down in one AOR and build up in another, the decisions that we make today will directly impact the level of success of these efforts. I cannot say it strongly enough. I will not support any measures that stress our forces and jeopardize the safety of our men and women in uniform. I will oppose also any plans that have the potential to damage or endanger our national security. Most concerning about the Efficiencies initiative are the plans to reduce the Army and Marine Corps end strength and to implement even deeper cuts beyond the initial $100 billion goal. The reduction of an additional $78 billion from the Department's funding top line caught this committee by surprise, and we intend to pursue the impact of this decision by the administration. We've asked much of our men and women in uniform over the years. They bravely fought and sacrificed for all of us, each and every one of us in this room. And I cannot in good conscience ask them to do more with less. Now I'd like to turn to our ranking member, Adam Smith from Washington, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, congratulations on being the chairman of the committee. This is our first formal open hearing. I have not had the chance to publicly congratulate you on that. You have already done a terrific job of reaching out to me and to our side of the aisle. I think we're going to have a great working relationship, and I very much look forward to that. So thank you, Buck, and congratulations again. And I think this hearing is perfectly appropriate. It is always the #1 duty of this committee to make sure that our national security is provided for, to make sure that our troops and those who are fighting to protect us have the resources that they need to do the job that we on the civilian side ask them to do. Everybody on this committee has done an outstanding job of making sure that that priority stays right at the top of our list, and I think we've done an admirable job of that through the years, and I'm sure that we will continue to do so. But as we go forward, we have to be mindful of the fact that just spending money doesn't necessarily make us safer. And I think anybody who spends, just a few minutes looking at the Pentagon budget, including the gentlemen before us today who are going to testify, will readily agree that there are savings and efficiencies to be found within the Department of Defense budget. There's absolutely no question about it. We have wrestled over the years with a variety of different programs that were funded that turned out not to do what we wanted them to do, and we wound up wasting a lot of money, quite frankly. I know this committee in particular in the last couple of years has been very focused on acquisition reform. Mr. Andrews has been a leader on that, as well as others on both sides of the aisle, to try to figure out how to get more for what we spend. And I want to emphasize that point. Wasting money anywhere in our budget, even in the Department of Defense, does not make us safer, does not protect our troops, and does not enhance our national security. In fact, it does just the opposite. So this committee, and you gentlemen, as well as everyone at the Pentagon, have an obligation not just to spend the money, but to make sure we're spending it efficiently and effectively. And I really want to applaud Secretary Gates and the others at the DoD for stepping up to that very difficult challenge, to looking at our budget and saying, where can we save money? Because there's no place where you're going to save money where somebody isn't going to complain about it. As the quote always goes, one person's waste is another person's income. It's not going to be easy, no matter how you do it. But I believe you gentlemen and Secretary Gates have stepped up and begun a very, very important process to find those savings. I applaud that effort. We look forward to learning more about the details. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't put this into the broader framework of our budget deficit in our budget. There is a growing consensus in this country that the deficit is too high, the debt is too high, and we are out of balance. Now, that consensus falls apart when you begin to talk about where you're going to cut or how you're going to raise the revenue to make up for that, understandably so, because these are difficult decisions. But the math here is unrelenting, and we shouldn't forget about that. 2010, we took in we spent $3.5 trillion and took in about $2.3 trillion in revenue. That's a $1.2 trillion difference. That's about 33% of everything we spend. So if you started just from a logical standpoint, you would say, to get us back to balance, we need to cut 33% out of everything that we spend. If you want to take 20% of the budget, which defense is, off the table, you're then down to about $2.8 trillion that you have to cut $1 trillion out of, and that means that you have to cut somewhere in the neighborhood of 45% out of everything. And that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Homeland Security, infrastructure, education, on down the line. I say all of that to make sure that we are mindful of the difficult challenge that we face, and also to remind everybody that our national security is also dependent upon having a strong economy. If we wind up, putting our country in a fiscal hole that we can't get out of, collapsing our economy, making it difficult for U.S. industries to prosper and thrive, they're not going to be in a position to provide the valuable help that they do to our national security apparatus. So we have a tough job ahead of us, but savings and efficiencies are going to have to be found, and I, for my part, am absolutely convinced that we can continue to provide the best national security possible, give our support to the troops that they deserve, and still find savings within the Pentagon budget. I think this hearing is the first start in that process. I know the gentlemen in front of us have worked very, very hard on this problem. I look forward to hearing their testimony, and I look forward to working with the Chairman and with the Pentagon and all members of this committee to find those savings and make sure that we continue to provide national security in every sense of the word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our witnesses this morning. We have first the Honorable William J. Lynn III, the Deputy Secretary of Defense from the Defense Department, General Peter W. Corelli, Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, Admiral Jonathan W. Greenert, Vice Chief of Naval Operations, U.S. Navy. General Joseph F. Dunford, Jr., Assistant Commandant, U.S. Marine Corps. General Philip M. Breedlove, Vice Chief of Staff, U.S. Air Force. Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today and discuss our efficiency efforts at the Department of Defense. Before I start, I'd like to extend my thoughts and support to one of the members of your committee who's not here today, Representative Gabrielle Gifford, as well as her husband, Navy Captain Mark Kelly, and the others affected by the events in Tucson. Gabby and Mark are part of the military family, and we are very much cheering Gabby on as she begins her rehabilitation. Today I'm pleased to be joined by the Vice Chiefs of Staff of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, as well as the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. I'll have a brief statement, and then we'll turn to your questions for the bulk of the hearing. The leadership of the Department is well aware that the nation is dealing with significant fiscal pressures. We owe it to the taxpayers to make the most of every dollar entrusted to us. Indeed, we could all benefit from following the direction of President Eisenhower, who believed we should spend whatever is necessary for national defense, but not one penny more. To that end, the Department sought in both the fiscal year 2010 and the fiscal year 2011 budgets to curtail or eliminate programs that were either too troubled to continue or that provided capabilities that were too narrow to justify their costs. We identified more than 20 programs in those categories that would have cost more than $300 billion if pursued to their completion. We have also initiated a comprehensive search for greater efficiencies in our business operations, our personnel system, and our headquarters structure. Specifically, Secretary Gates laid out 3 objectives that I will describe today. The services first were directed to achieve $100 billion in efficiencies over the 5-year future year defense plan. Second, the services could retain and invest those efficiency savings in enhancements of high-priority warfighting programs. And third, the Department developed additional efficiencies and other changes to accommodate a $78 billion reduction in our top line that contributed to the Administration's deficit reduction efforts. Over the past 6 months, the military services have undertaken a comprehensive examination of their overhead accounts to achieve the $100 billion savings objective the Secretary issued them. The savings come from numerous sources. A portion are generated by reorganizations that reassign personnel and reduce layering in the Department. For example, the Army will consolidate 6 installation management command regions into 4 and close the evaluation task force. The Navy will eliminate selected squadron staffs and disestablish the 2nd Fleet in Norfolk. The Air Force will consolidate 4 Air Operations Centers and 3 numbered Air Force staffs. The services will also achieve savings through implementing better business practices. For example, the Army will leverage efforts of other organizations to reduce the number of data centers, and the Navy will shift 6,000 billets from shore-based installations to increase shipboard manning. Finally, the Air Force will implement better business practices in satellite procurement, establishing more stability in the development process and utilizing block buys in procurement. In addition to these business practice efficiencies, the services garnered savings through reductions in programs that either cost too much or provided too little capability. The Army will terminate procurement of the SLAM-RAM surface-to-air missile and the non-line-of-sight launch system. The Marine Corps will terminate the expeditionary fighting vehicle. As directed by the Secretary, all savings realized by a military department will be retained and reinvested in that department. Approximately $28 billion of the total savings will be used over the next 5 years to deal with higher-than-expected operating expenses. The remaining savings, some $70 billion, will be used to enhance high-priority military capabilities. The Air Force will begin development and acquisition of a new long-range bomber and maintain maximum procurement levels of Reaper UAVs. The Army will invest more heavily in modernization of the Army's battle fleet of Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, and Stryker wheeled vehicles. The Navy plans to use its savings to buy 6 more ships than were in last year's plan, including an additional destroyer. In sum, our efficiency initiatives will permit improvement in warfighting capabilities in ways that would not have been fiscally possible in the absence of the efficiency campaign. However, Congressman Smith indicated the strength of our national defense ultimately depends on a strong economy as well. So as part of the administration's broader effort to address the deficit, the Department reduced its top-line budget for FY12 through FY 2016. This reduction, which totaled $78 billion compared with last year's plan, will still result in a defense base budget request of $553 billion in fiscal year 2012 and modest real growth in the near years of the future year's defense plan. We accommodated this top-line reduction through additional efficiencies and other changes outside the warfighting accounts. For instance, Secretary Gates has imposed a freeze on civilian personnel levels in the Department through FY 2013, allowing limited exceptions to accommodate growth in the acquisition workforce and a few other essential areas. The Secretary also mandated a reduction of 10% per year for 3 years in the number of contractors who augment government staffs. We have sought to address the enormous growth in our medical costs through management efficiencies while continuing to improve high-quality military health care. We believe, though, it is time to lift the 15-year freeze on TRICARE enrollment fees for working-age retirees. We believe it is time to phase out subsidies that DoD currently provides to a small number of non-military hospitals, and we are making adjustments in pharmacy copays that will both, we think, improve the benefit as well as develop cost efficiencies. Finally, we are taking steps to streamline our organizational structure. As the Secretary announced last August, we are disestablishing the Joint Forces Command and the Business Transformation Agency, and we are eliminating the position of Assistant Secretary for Networks and Information Integration. In addition, we will pursue efficiencies in intelligence operations and in our information technology investments. Mr. Chairman, the proposals we are describing today are the result of a detailed, comprehensive budget and program review led by Secretary Gates and involving the senior military and civilian leadership of the Department. I know that some will argue that our proposals cut defense too much. Others will argue that we have not cut enough. We believe this budget strikes the right balance for these difficult times. In Secretary Gates' own words, this budget proposal represents a reasonable, responsible, and sustainable level of defense spending for the next 5 years. I want to end my statement by thanking the Chairman and the Committee for your strong support of the Department, and particularly for your strong support of the men and women who bear the burdens of our national defense. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The $78 billion top-line reduction was a surprise to us when we went into the briefing with the Secretary. We thought we were going to be talking and getting more detail on the $100 billion, then we also found out about the $78 billion. What guidance was provided by the administration to the Department with regard to the top-line budget reductions across the future year's defense program, and when was this guidance received?
Mr. Chairman, the top line, as this past year, as it all, I think, in every year with every administration, was developed in a discussion between the White House, led in particular by the Office of Management and Budget, and the Defense Department. We had an iterative discussion that included the President. We settled on the $78 billion number as a number that we thought we could achieve through efficiencies that did not undermine any of our warfighting capabilities. And as to the timing, the final numbers were developed in December.
And have other departments received similar instructions?
Yes, they have, but I wouldn't be able to give you the exact numbers of those other departments. But the similar process was done with all of the departments.
Similar percentages of cuts?
I'm not in a position to release the whole administration's budget. My belief, though, is that the Defense Department had fewer reductions than many other departments.
And we'll see those when the President's budget is submitted?
When the President's budget is submitted, you'll see all of them, of course, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. How will this $78 billion top-line reduction affect the execution of the fiscal year 2011 funding priorities?
At least off the top of my head, Mr. Chairman, I don't think it would affect the FY11. The challenge with fiscal year 11 is that we don't yet know what the final number is going to be. As you well know, we're operating under a continuing resolution, and we're waiting Congressional action. So the challenge in fiscal year 11 is how to operate either under a continuing resolution or ultimately a mid-year appropriation. That was a challenge in preparing the program. It's a challenge in executing the budget. But I don't think the development of the 12 to 16 program will affect execution of fiscal 11.
Okay. The Secretary stated on January 6th that this plan, and I quote, represents, in my view, the minimum level of defense spending that's necessary given the complex and unpredictable array of security challenges the United States faces around the globe. Then he went on to explain why further cuts to force structure would be calamitous. However, the Secretary also indicated just last year that 2 to 3% real growth was necessary beyond 2015 to prevent cuts to force structure. How will you maintain this level of modernization that the Secretary believes is necessary to protect our national security in the face of 0% real growth in the coming years?
The Secretary has indicated that to maintain force structure and to absorb the growth that you see due to technology enhancements and personnel benefit enhancements, that you do need a 2 to 3% real growth with a constant force structure. For that reason, when we are going to have a proposed flat budget in fiscal 15 and 16, we believe that you do need some force reductions, and we have put planning in there for a reduction of 27,000 in the Army end strength and 15 to 20,000 in the Marine Corps end strength. Now, that reduction will take place after we think we will have drawn down substantially in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and so that our international commitments should not be at today's levels.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, just as a starting point, can you keep the numbers in, I think, proper perspective? Can you walk us through a little bit how much the defense budget has increased in the last 6 or 7 years? You talk about those in-strength numbers. They've gone up significantly, and understandably so, with our commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan. But do you have just a little bit of the numbers of how much we've actually increased the budget in the last 7 or 8 years in the Department of Defense? And try to include OCO in that as well, not just what the baseline is.
I believe since 2001, the budget, the base budget has come close to doubling.
Right.
And of course, the end strength numbers are up, particularly in the Army and the Marine Corps, and would still be higher even after the proposed reductions in 2015 and 2016 than they were when Secretary Gates took office, and that was really the high point of the Iraqi conflict. In terms of the OCO budget, that is about $160 billion this year. Obviously, going back to 2001, before the conflict, before 9/11, before the conflict in Afghanistan, that essentially would have been zero.
Right. But if we add it up over the 6 or 7 years that we've had supplementals, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 trillion in addition to that doubling of the defense budget that has happened.
That's correct.
Fair. A couple of quick questions on specific programs. The F-35, most expensive program we've got going, has experienced some troubles. Can you give us a little bit of an indication of our efforts to try to get those costs under control and get us an actual product for a reasonable price?
Yes, Congressman. The F-35 is certainly a critical program for the Department. It's the fifth generation fighter that we think that we need to have in the decade following this. The development program, frankly, has not gone as smoothly as we'd hoped. The costs have risen. We have taken additional steps this year to, frankly, present the committee with a more conservative program in three fundamental ways. The most difficult aspect of the program has been the development of the Stovall version of the F-35, which is the most complicated version. We have decoupled the development of that aircraft from the carrier-based and the Air Force versions, which are proceeding a bit better, so that they will not be held back. And we've put it on what the Secretary has called a 2-year probation. We're going to continue the program. We're going to try and work through the development issues, and we're going to decide at the end of 2 years whether to go forward with the program in the strong hope that we will have solved those problems at the end of that 2 years. The second thing we're doing is we are slowing the ramp of procurement. The procurement will be flat from fiscal 11 to 12, and the ramp will be slower by over 100 aircraft in the plan than we had in the 5-year plan than we had planned last year. This is reducing concurrency and getting further in development before we invest more in production. It is a more conservative approach. And then finally, third, to address any operational gaps that we have by slowing that procurement, we've added about 40 F-18s to the line so that we are able to fill out the fleet in the interim period.
Great. And then that obviously is a major challenge. The tens of billions of dollars more than was expected that are being spent on that critical piece of our national security presents some of the challenges for the budget going forward. Just one final question. General Corelli, can you walk us through a little bit the early infantry brigade combat team update, sort of as I like to refer to it, son of future combat systems, if you will, our effort to update those programs, information warfare in the battlefield space for our brigade teams has not gone terribly smoothly, as you know, in terms of the testing, and I know you've been working hard to update that, make sure we get the equipment we need, get rid of what doesn't work and keep what does. Can you just walk us through a little bit in light of the most recent testing, where we're at on that and how you're planning on going forward?
Well, we're very, very pleased with where we are with the network right now. And we are very pleased with the SUG-V, which is the little robot that goes around. Some of the others have created some challenges for us, and we'll be looking before too long, once the RMD is complete, to make some decisions on some of the other systems.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much. Whatever our top line is, we need to be as efficient as we can in using the monies. There are three areas that I know we all have concerns about, and I just wanted to see where you are going with trying to solve these problems. I'm a huge supporter of research and early R&D. You never know, if you don't try, what will come of it. So I don't want my concern here to be in any way indicate that I'm not a big supporter of research and R&D. I think we need to do more of that, not less of that. I think we spend too little money there. But I'm very much concerned that we have too many programs that continue to the late R&D stage. There is no way we could possibly procure all of them, and so we have to find a mechanism for boarding these things earlier rather than later, because there's just no way that we could procure all of the end items with the number of programs that we now have in late R&D. How are we going to address that problem? A second problem is when a program is not going well, it has to really, really be moribund before we abort it. Two recent programs are Future Combat Systems and the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. You know, and after years and years and billions of dollars, we finally said, hey, that's not a good idea. I think there were a number of people along the way who said way earlier than that that was not a good idea, that we shouldn't be doing that. How do we address that problem so we don't come to the point where we have these sunk costs of billions of dollars in boarding a program where parts are made in many, many districts across the country, so it gets wide congressional support. And the third problem is there's always some new technology we can add. I've been here 18 years now. We never have finished a program on time and on budget, and we are partly responsible for that because we keep saying, gee, couldn't it be a little better and let's add this new technology? How do we determine it's good enough and we stop there? We have an open architecture so that we can add these improvements later, because many times we're going to have to live with these things for the next 40 years, so we want it to be as good as it can be. How are we addressing these problems? There are huge potential savings in these areas. How do we get there?
Let me take your questions in order, Mr. Bartlett. One, we agree with you on the basic R&D, and the budget that we'll send to you next month will indeed have real growth in basic R&D. Try to protect that seed corn that you're rightly concerned about. With regard to decisions on programs, I guess that's not a criticism I think Secretary Gates has suffered from. He has made, I think, some tough decisions, whether it's on the presidential helicopter or the F-22 earlier, or the future combat system that you mentioned, which he terminated, and the expeditionary fighting vehicle this year. I think the thrust of your question is right. The department needs to make hard decisions early, and we are endeavoring to do that. I think you're right. It's challenging, both in terms of the support programs build up, as well as it is always difficult to know when you've reached the point of, do you have enough knowledge to make the decision, or is it going to get better just around the next corner, which tends to be the promise. Your third question on how do we, I think it goes to what the effort Mr. Andrews and others led on this committee. It's the fundamental thrust of acquisition reform. It's how do you have budget and schedule be equally important as performance? You have to balance between all three. I think we have often balanced in favor of performance for often good reasons, but budget and schedule suffers. We are trying to, in our acquisition reform efforts, balance better. And you will see, for example, in the program we're presenting next month that we've, as the Secretary's announced, we are going to pursue a new bomber program as part of a family of systems approach to long-range strike. An important element of that new bomber program will be a firm view of what the unit cost of that bomber ought to be, and that we ought to develop the best possible technology, but at that price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, welcome. First question is for General Corelli. The committee was told by Undersecretary Westphal that the Army was intending on reinvesting some of its savings in the efficiency account in the Abrams, Bradleys, and Stryker vehicle, doing upgrades for those three. Could you provide us with a little more detail on those upgrades, and also how much additional funding was the Army able to allocate to modernize these particular vehicles, and how will it provide better capability for the soldiers?
Well, those are the three systems that we currently have been able to put some money in from our efficiencies, along with many others. In Stryker, I think we're moving ahead with a double V hull. We have been completing some testing, and that testing has come out very, very satisfactory. We are very, very pleased with it, and are moving ahead to provide additional protection for the entire crew of the Stryker, above what we have right now with the flat bottom hull. with some of the add-on armor kits. It's a great improvement. We will be making increases or changes, improvements to both the Stryker and the Bradley, and I'll have to get you the exact dollars on that at a later time, sir, and I will get those to you.
Okay. The other area I'd like to ask is in the area of the Patriot missile upgrades, and also the counter-rocket artillery mortar systems. What is the Army intending to do with those kinds of upgrades, and how will they play out into the capabilities to continue to procure, and obviously with the end result of helping to protect our soldiers in the field?
Well, sir, those improvements grew out of our portfolio reviews, where we took like-type systems and looked at the entire portfolio and compared systems. That came out of a portfolio we call air and missile defense. And when we looked at that portfolio, we saw we had some broken programs. One of the programs that we had concern with was SLAM-RAM. The cost of that missile for SLAM-RAM had grown from $300,000 to, I'm told, over $1 million a copy now. In POM 1015, we were only buying 100 of those missiles. And quite frankly, we saw changes in the threat from the time that program had been conceived. We were able to take the savings from that particular program and apply them against Patriot and against counter-rocket and counter-mortar, because, quite frankly, counter-rocket and counter-mortar are the threats that are affecting our troops downrange today. So with over $1 billion in SLAM-RAM savings, we were able to reinvest that in counter-rocket and counter-mortar, and also in upgrading Patriot.
Very good. Thank you, General. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned Joint Forces Command in your opening statement, and as I'm sure you remember from your previous time, a primary reason that the command was created was to have a major command that looks forward, a future command, and have joint experimentation come together so that you have a person at the table who is not just worried about what's happening today, but looking ahead. So if the command goes away, and there's lots of reasons I understand to do that, who does that? Or is it y'all's view that you don't need that person who is future-oriented with the joint experimentation capability?
We agree with you, Congressman, that certainly looking to the future, and in particular the emphasis on jointness through experimentation, through development of doctrine are critical roles. We did not think at the point we are in the department, that we needed a command to do that. Now, we are retaining many of the sub-organizations, about half is the rough estimate, that we're doing that, including the Joint Experimentation Group. They will report, the final recommendations are still being developed, but the joint staff and the chairman and the vice chairman will play a stronger role in advocating for jointness, in advocating for development of joint doctrine in this post-GIFCOM world.
Yeah, I think the concern is you bury stuff down in the bureaucracy, it's never going to percolate through, and that's part of where we were before Joint Forces Command. General Dunford, I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding was the Marine Corps has had a requirement that the Navy's going to get the Marines so close, so many miles from shore, then they got to be transferred into some amphibious vehicles that will get them onto shore in a certain amount of time so that they're in fighting condition. Have those requirements changed? Have the miles changed? Have the time changed?
Congressman, thank you. First, we are and continue to be committed to the capability that was represented by the EFE, that is, to be able to provide the nation with assured access. Historically, we have planned over the past 2 decades for Marines to be discharged at 25 nautical miles. In recent discussions with the Navy, those figures have in fact changed, and we're in the process now of refining the requirement. And we think it's somewhere in excess of 12 nautical miles, but something less than 25 nautical miles. So we are, in fact, reviewing the requirement right now in the context of both our capabilities and limitations as well as the enemy's capability limitations, particularly some newly fielded equipment inside of the Department of the Navy.
Admiral, is the Navy okay with getting closer to shore and being more at risk of missiles from reaching the ships?
Congressman, we are. We've taken a very close look at this, and with our integrated fire control capabilities in the future, our ability to network with the self-protection, the RAM, and some of the other systems, that's rolling airframe missile, that we have, our counter-swarm capability, we believe, and I'm in concurrence with General Dunford, somewhere around 12 miles, maybe a little bit more, is acceptable. We've modeled this closely. We've war-gamed it closely. We're reasonably comfortable. There may be situations when, as the maritime component commander, we may not have as much time as we assume we will have, where we'll have to look at the risk factor regarding that. That will be the individual operator's judgment on that case. But overall, we're good with it.
Well, I appreciate y'all's answers. I think these are just two examples I picked of where we want to have further discussions with you. There has been a sense, at least from my part, that some edict comes down from on high saying cut the budget and y'all do the best you can and try to put a rosy face on it. And I think the concern that some of us have is, okay, what are the implications of eliminating this vehicle, eliminating this command? Have we thought through who does it, what kind of capability we lose if that happens? And there is, personally, I think there is concern about having that thought through and analyzed rather than going through strictly a budget exercise, even though obviously all of us are in favor of finding efficiencies wherever we can. So I appreciate it. I think there is further discussion to be had. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Secretary, thank you for referencing the work the members of this committee did on procurement reform. Mr. Conaway deserves at least equal credit for that, as do many members, and we appreciate the fact you're already starting to implement those reforms. Thank you. I wanted to come back to the top-line discussion where Secretary Gates on January 6th talked about the $78 billion off the top line through the efficiencies that have been outlined. Under the 5-year plan that you're presently working under, defense spending will still be considerably higher 5 years from today than it is today. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
If I look at the math correctly, the difference between the plan that you're presently operating on and what Secretary Gates has now suggested is, instead of the defense budget being 17% higher than it is today, it will be about 14.5% higher than it is today. Is that essentially right?
I don't have the math in front of me, but it sounds right.
Yeah, the numbers to me were $567 billion in the base budget in the first year and $663 by the 5th year. He would take that down by $78 billion over 5 years. Given that, I want to commend you and the Secretary for the real choices that you're putting before this committee and the Congress. The easiest thing to do here, has been done for 2 decades or longer, is to say there can be operating efficiencies and overhead savings and we can spend less if we do that. In the 20 years since that's been said, the budget has probably tripled, not just doubled. So there really have to be some real decisions, and I think you've raised a very interesting one with the EFV recommendation. I know that the EFV had a Nunn-McCurdy breach in 2007, and as our expert staff tells us, a Nunn-McCurdy breach is triggered under the law when a program exceeds its budgeted schedule by 25% or more. Do you happen to recall the magnitude of the Nunn-McCurdy breach for the EFV? How far over budget was it?
Unless General Dunford can provide it, I have to provide it for the record.
Congressman, I can talk to the unit cost. The unit cost was $5 million in 1995. At that time, we had planned to buy 1,013 vehicles. The program now is 573 vehicles, and it's $17 million for unit cost.
So
as you can see, it's significantly more. I think the Nunn-McCurdy threshold is about 25%, so we exceeded the Nunn-McCurdy threshold for unit cost.
So let me get this straight. When the Congress made a decision to procure these vessels in 1995, we were anticipating they'd cost $5 million a copy, and that's ballooned to $17 million?
That's correct.
So it's more than tripled in cost. In layperson's language, why is that? Why did it more than triple in cost?
One critical factor is that at the time in 1995, we plan on buying 1,013 vehicles. The current program is 573 vehicles, so that accounts for some of the unit cost. Quite frankly, Congressman, I can't tell you why the rest, why it exceeded cost in other areas. I do know that the unit cost was impacted by the total number of vehicles that we're in to buy, and other factors. Really, I think probably General Dynamics can be better able to explain that than me.
My understanding is that we've not yet passed milestone B on this program, that we were approaching it but not yet passed it.
Congressman, we're just about to be at knowledge point 2 in February.
Mm-hmm. And what planning has taken place in the Department with respect to an alternative if, in fact, we don't procure these vessels that have been presently planned? How would we get Marines from the ship to the shore?
Congressman, as I mentioned earlier, first, we are committed to continuing to be able to do that and provide assured access for the nation. So we're committed to getting a vehicle that moves from ship to shore. We believe that the knowledge that we have learned in the EFV program, combined with some new acquisition processes, will allow us to get a vehicle that will allow us to meet the operational requirement at significantly less cost.
Is there going to be a gap between when we get to that point and now? Is there any operating deficiency that the Marines would be subjected to?
We can currently meet our requirements. The use of the assault amphibious vehicle, which is a legacy program, absolutely has an effect on our tactics, techniques, and procedures. So we mitigate the risk of a legacy program by our employment concepts. What we will do now is take a look at a service life extension program for the assault amphibious vehicle to address some of the lethality shortfalls, some of the mobility shortfalls, and then we also at the same time will take a look at what the expeditionary fighting vehicle really represents is a small part of our overall ground tactical vehicle plan, and about 2/3 of what we need to come from ship to shore in armored vehicles. So we'll take a look also now at addressing what we call the Marine Personnel Carrier, which is the balance of our amphibious capability.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I didn't want to interrupt when you were asking the questions, but I'd like to have a little understanding. When the Secretary briefed us on this additional $78 billion, what he said was next year's budget would have a 1% increase, the following year a 0.5%, and then 3 years of flat. Now, how does that grow those kind of numbers?
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah.
If I may, before the Secretary does. My understanding is that the numbers are in real dollar terms. So that's how.
That's part of the answer. Mr. Chairman, we don't actually know what the fiscal 11 to 12 growth rate is, again, because we don't know what the fiscal 11 budget, but it will be somewhere between 1.5% and 3% real growth. That's on top of inflation, which is in the 1.5% to 2%. So you're looking at nominal growth of 4 or 5% fiscal 12. Then the real growth in fiscal 13 and 14 is 1% in 13, 0.5% in 14, then 0 real in 15 and 16. In other words, the budget would still grow, but only to keep pace with inflation. So that when you net those numbers up, I believe you end up with the line that Congressman Andrews led with.
Okay, so in current dollars, it wouldn't grow by those numbers. It would be inflated dollars.
In current dollars, it would grow more because of the addition of inflation. That's right. When the Secretary said to you 1%, 0.5%, 0, he was talking real. You have to add inflation to that.
Thank you. Mr. Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to start by making a distinction between two things, and I have to say that I don't have so many questions as answers. We still get 5 minutes for answers, so I'm going to just give you a little bit of where I'm coming from sitting in this committee. The first thing is what you've done. You start at the beginning of the year decided we're going to cut defense by $78 billion, make some big changes in various programs, and a whole series of decisions. The question is, were those all good decisions or not? That's one question. The second point, though, is how you did it. The U.S. Constitution requires the members of this committee to be involved and be part of the decisions for national security. The end of last year, this committee was approached on the fact that we had an opportunity to get 2 purchases for 10 littoral combat ships, which was different than what we had planned. At the last minute, we were said, this would be a good idea for the Navy. It saves us some money, and it's a good thing to do. We took a look at the numbers in a very compressed time frame, passed legislation, and supported the Navy in that decision, even though we had no idea that it was coming till a week or so before, a couple weeks before, when we actually made the legislation and got it done. We worked with you as co-partners. This month, we receive like a CC on a general press release to the public that we've made all of these unilateral decisions, and we had no idea a bunch of them were even coming. The expeditionary fighting vehicle strikes me as one where the assumptions are very thin. It appears that we are almost canceling a capability in order to make a $78 billion cut on the surface. We'll look into it. But my concern is that you are trying to make, or you have inadvertently made this committee irrelevant because you're not keeping us in the loop, informing us of what you're looking at. That has gotten progressively worse over 10 years to the where it is right now. And that's unacceptable, at least to me as a subcommittee chair, and I believe I may speak for a few other members of this committee that we want to be part of the decision-making process. If you go back 200 years and look at the history of our national defense, you find that it's a partnership between military and civilians, and both sides play a role in that, and at times the civilian side, that is this committee, has made recommendations in 20/20 hindsight that have turned out to be very good military decisions, such as, among other things, arming predators. And I don't like, and I don't think this committee will tolerate being left out of the process of decision making. So we will have our hearings and we will look into those decisions, and the decisions that we think are poor, we will not be shy about explaining why we think those are poor decisions. But I just think it's clear in January, when we're starting off on a new foot, that we understand each other, and I'm going to try to explain it so that you understood where we're coming from, because we don't like to be called at the last minute and said, I talked to the Secretary of the Navy 2 days ago, and I said, I'm very concerned about cutting the defense budget. He said, oh, there's not any cuts to the defense budget that he knew of. Well, we had a speech last night that talked about it. Now, to the overall concept, I think it is in your best interest to use us as part of your team to help you do your jobs. I think it's foolish to ignore us, because here's what's going on. You want to take a big look at where we are budget-wise in this country. You take your entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, add the other entitlements, and then add service on the debt, which is like an entitlement, because when we sell a U.S. Treasury or something, we have to keep paying the interest like a little machine that spits out dollar bills. We can't not pay that. So you take all those entitlements together, add them up. Right now, those entitlements are equal to the revenue that we take in as a nation. So you can cut defense to zero, cut discretionary spending to zero, and we're still just even. You cannot pay for entitlements by cutting defense, but you can destroy our country by cutting defense. Now, you want to take a look at some concerning numbers. If you take a look at defense spending as a percent of total budget authority, we are now, with these proposed cuts, to the same place we were in '98 when we hollowed out our forces. That's the kind of thing that it's our job to be concerned with, and our job to go to bat and say to the Budget Committee, wait a minute, we really can't take defense. We can't take the Marines and deny them the capability to go from ship to shore. And if you want to put new engines in some vehicles that date back to the Korean era, and they can go from 4 to 6 knots. Somehow or other, I'm not seeing that as a very workable solution, with all due respect to my good friends from the Marine Corps. I know you're trying to do what you think you got to do budget-wise, but some of these decisions need to be run by this committee first, and I just want to put a marker down. Mr. Chairman, if I'm a little too strong, correct me, but that's my strong sense. There needs to be partnership. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you all for your distinguished service. I want to turn to an issue that involves our people, the men and women who serve. I know that the Department is looking at a number of reforms in the area of military health care. And clearly, in many ways, everything is on the table here. But I wonder if you could share with me what concerns the services have raised as it reflects some of the proposals that you have in health care. Now, I know we're not looking at specifics right now, but I'm just wondering somewhat about that process and about how the services are weighing in, what their concerns are. What have they raised?
Well, let me let the Vice Chief speak for themselves. Let me just give you an opening comment. As you indicated, part of the development of this program was an attempt to rein in health care costs, which have more than doubled over the past 10 years. There's some proposals with regard to fees, with hospitals, pharmacy benefit, and overall efficiencies. Happy to go into more detail at the appropriate time. But the process by which those were developed was a full department-wide process led by the Secretary, where he had a series of meetings that included the entire leadership, the chiefs, the service secretaries, the combatant commanders, senior OSD leadership. I know Chairman Mullen led at least one, I think more than one, tank session. So this was a very fulsome process. But let me turn to the Vice Chiefs for their reaction.
I would just echo what Secretary Lynn said. We were part of that process and agreed with the decisions that have been made. I will tell you, in my area, the area that I'm most concerned about is I don't have enough uniformed health care providers. We made a decision in the Army a while ago to cap the number of uniformed military health care providers we had at a certain number, and I need to find room inside my end strength to add some more. It's just not enough. We've been able to make up with that through contract health care in certain areas. But when it comes to areas like behavioral health care, I've got a real problem there, as the nation has a real problem there, because we just don't have enough. So I find myself competing with the nation to get that really, really important asset that the United States Army needs at this particular time. A great example I'll give you, second and third order effects, is I need alcohol and substance abuse counselors. But many of them have the degrees necessary to fleet up to become behavioral health specialists at an increased salary. So what I find myself doing, as hard as I try to hire alcohol and drug abuse counselors, I bring in 5 to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and I lose 5 as they fleet up to behavioral health specialist positions that pay additional funds. So that's an area for me that is of concern.
Thank you, ma'am. I echo General Corelli's comments regarding uniformed health care providers. Our concern was, as we reviewed, and there were more initiatives than what is in the budget, and some were removed. Our concern was to ensure that our active duty members and their families received proper care and world-class care that they deserve, and we're comfortable with that. Make sure that that availability of care outside the service when need to, consults, that was that capacity was still there, and we're comfortable with that, and that pharmacy, any changes to the pharmacy, that we could retain that service and make it available. Again, we were comfortable. Ma'am, I'd say it was a collaborative process.
Yeah. So you're saying, particularly on the pharmacy benefit, that you didn't see any drawbacks to that would affect the men and women?
That's correct.
All right.
Congressman, like the other Vice Chiefs, our primary concern was ensuring that our Marines that are forward deployed have world-class medical care. We're also concerned making sure that our Marines, when they come home, and their families have world-class medical care. And we're unaware of any initiatives in the proposals that would degrade that health care. And so we have very much been part of that process. And we have looked at the other initiatives that don't affect the active duty force, and have been, again, part of that process, and feel like we have an opportunity to shape that.
Ma'am, I would echo the remarks of my fellow vice chiefs. It was a collaborative process. We were a part of it, and we joined that process. In the Air Force, we remain focused on the downrange care of our troops involved in the conflict. But we recently finished the Year of the Family in the Air Force, and we focused on the aftercare as our troops come home, and also taking care of those families when their troops are downrange. And we continue to remain focused on that, and we don't see any detriment to that in what we see in this business.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, because I think there have been some concerns that there hasn't been the kind of involvement of the different services in that decision. So I want to be sure that we're balancing the need to find some savings, but at the same time, clearly those benefits are expected, and people deserve those benefits, and we want to be sure that we're doing that in the proper way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you, and as you know, we've got a limited amount of time, so I'll be concise, and I hope you will be as well. In your statement, you said we owe it to the taxpayers to make the most of every dollar entrusted to us, and then you go on to say one of the ways we're going to do that is the services will achieve savings through implementing better business practices. I looked at many of our Fortune 500 companies to see some of their business practices, and if you look at companies like Walmart, AT&T, Hewlett-Packard, Verizon, IBM, Procter & Gamble, Kroger, Costco, Boeing, Home Depot, Target, they will indicate to you that the core business practice that is superior to all of the others is to make sure they know where their money is going by having audited financial statements. In fact, Congress feels so strongly about that, we required them by law to do the same. Now, in the Department of Defense, we are giving to you what would essentially be the 22nd largest economy in the world if you were a country. It's over $700 billion last year. And as you know, by law, we require our agency heads to submit to us audited financial statements each year so that we know where the money's going. Now, 21 different agencies have complied with that. Clearly, the statute came back and said the Department of Defense needed to do that. And in your statement, you go on to say, proposals we're describing today are the result of a detailed, comprehensive budget and program review led by Secretary Gates and involving the entire senior military and civilian leadership of the Department. So, Mr. Secretary, my question for you, first one today, is what percentage of the $700 billion budget of the Department of Defense did Secretary Gates file the audited financial statements required by law in 2007?
Mr. Forbes, the Department does not have an auditable financial statement.
So none were filed in 2007?
I think one or two agencies, but it's a very small part of the budget.
First of all, you're the Chief Management Officer of the Department of Defense. Is it your testimony today that you do not know how many were filed, or are you testifying that 2 agencies did file on the Department of Defense?
I'm going to have to provide the exact number.
I'll tell you it was none. How about in 2008?
Well, 2008, I wasn't at the Department.
Do you know whether any financial statements were filed?
I doubt.
There were none.
I think it would have been any.
How about 2009?
I think the same answer.
How about 2010?
I believe the same answer.
Do you know how many will be filed in 2011?
The same.
Do you know what percentage of the $700 billion budget in the Department of Defense will be an audit-ready posture for 2011? That is, that we could even be capable of auditing.
I don't think any, sir.
The President last night told us that in making decisions in our country, he said, and quote, "It will be harder because we'll argue about everything, the cost, the details, the letter of every law. Of course, some countries don't have this problem. If the central government wants a railroad, they build a railroad. No matter how many homes get bulldozed, if they don't want a bad story in the newspaper, it doesn't get written. But we all believe in the rights enshrined in our Constitution." Mr. Secretary, I believe that the Department of Defense has developed the philosophy of bulldozing. When you make a decision, you make the decision, and as Congressman Aiken said, you don't even include us, you don't even give us the information, and then you bulldoze ahead without doing the tough work of trying to work it through us. You know, when we ask you to bring to us individuals who can testify, give us your analysis, give us your documentation of these cuts or anything else, you refuse to do it. So then we ask you to do the report so that we can get the information and we can reach an analysis. And the Secretary does press conferences poo-pooing reports to Congress, and that's just too tough, it's too hard, we're not going to do reports. So then we put it in the law and we say you got to comply with it because this is the law of the land. But when we did that for a shipbuilding plan, the Secretary just said, I'm not going to give it to you. When we put it in the aviation plan, the Secretary said, we're just not going to give it to you. And when we require audited financial statements so we can just know where our money's going, the Secretary just says not going to do it. And the question we ought to be asking ourselves, is DOD above the law? What do we have to do to get you to comply with the law? And how can we even begin to talk about savings and efficiencies when we cannot verify a single dollar of where our defense budget is going? And Mr. Chairman, I close by just saying this. Shame on us if we continue to give the Department of Defense billions of dollars without doing the most basic of all good business practices by simply knowing where that money is going. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, if I could respond to a couple of the remarks there. First, I agree with Congressman Forbes. We do need to develop auditable financial statements. We've developed a plan to do that. The plan is quite aggressive. It's going to be difficult to achieve, and we have focused on the budgetary resources for the reasons that you gave. But that is the most important responsibility to the Department, to be able to tell the Congress and the taxpayers how each dollar is spent. So the Secretary very much agrees that we need to comply with this. We have a plan to do that. With regard to the shipbuilding and the aviation plans, I think that was a disagreement with the committees, as we did provide those when we had them. When the committee was asking for it was in the first couple of months where the administration had taken office, and they simply didn't exist. As soon as they existed, we did provide them to the Department.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to take more of my time, but just to respond to the Secretary. Mr. Secretary, it wasn't the committees that requested it. It was the law that requested when you had to file it, and it told you what to do if you didn't have a plan. And secondly, if any of these Fortune 500 companies came up and said, we just can't comply with the law because it's too hard, what would we do to them? And you know, I think it's a priority that we ought to make in the Department, and we ought to insist on it to this committee. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the extra.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations on your first hearing. I'd like to just say that I actually think that on the merits, Congressman Forbes is absolutely right about what the law says, and it was very frustrating over the last 2 years that we didn't get that shipbuilding plan. But as you said, we did get it last year. And I'd like to actually focus for a minute, Admiral Greenert, on the testimony regarding the impact of these changes to the Navy and ship acquisition. Again, the testimony we received is that the savings will be directed towards, again, reinvestment in the Navy, and that 6 ships are going to be added to the Navy's fleet as a result of this. And well, I guess the first question I have is that going to change the shipbuilding plan that was submitted last year?
Yes, sir, it will. From the perspective of there will be an additional 6 ships to that shipbuilding plan. We've been able to move ahead in some of our required shipbuilding, for example, oilers. We need to get double-hulled oilers. We're operating on a waiver that is a U.S. waiver, and around the world we may not have those waivers, so that helps us toward the longer view. It brings us with another destroyer, Arleigh Burke destroyer, which helps us, obviously increases our warfighting capability right there. And then, of course, the last one would be the Tagos, or the sonar trailing ship, if you will, which increases our ASW capability.
Well, to me, you know, that's a priority.
Mr. Courtney?
Yes.
If I could just interrupt just for a second. We have been told with the new schedule this year that we won't be interrupted with votes. That will start the week of the 14th. We have just been interrupted by a vote, and the votes are going to be shorter than in the past. We can't wait till it's almost over. So you will be the last questioner, but anybody else that wants to leave now to vote, there will be 2 votes, and then we will return, and Mr. Wilson will be first after Mr. Courtney.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, what you just described obviously addresses a priority that this committee, and particularly the Sea Power Committee, has been struggling with for years, which is despite the massive increase in the Pentagon, we have steadily seen the fleet size fall below what the Navy has told us repeatedly is necessary, a 313-ship Navy. And to me, if we're finding ways to, again, make the Navy more efficient and reinvest it in what I think everybody agrees is what we all want, then that's certainly not weakening our defense. It's actually accelerating the path to get to the goal that we all want. The sort of story that I think, cautionary tale that I think we in this committee have to keep aware of, particularly in the context of shipbuilding, is what happened with the Zumwalt, the DDG 1000, where again, anything goes in terms of the way that was put together, and it crashed and collapsed of its own weight because of the high cost. And last year, the shipbuilding plan that was sent over projected out a huge bulge that was going to be caused by the SSBN price tag, $7 billion per copy. It's my understanding that, again, the Pentagon has really worked hard to try and bring that price down so that we don't find ourselves in a Zumwalt-like situation 5-10 years from now. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that cost savings measure and any progress that the Navy's achieved.
Thank you for the question, sir. Yes, we have a very collaborative process, I believe, on the Ohio replacement program. A little bit to Mr. Bartlett's question or comment earlier, how is it that we can interject, if you will, cost as a key performance parameter? And so we have a cost threshold and objective on the Ohio replacement program. Point here is, as we develop this, as we are into the early phases of design, we have to address cost again and again and again as a function and balance it against the capabilities. We haven't been very good at doing that in the early phases. It's been all about capability, and then we deal with the bill later. So we're very focused on that. As you know, sir, because of your background and in your area of shipbuilding, this is a fairly well-defined capability that we're building, and so this is a good program to get started in this regard.
And certainly the shipbuilding plan, the nuclear posture review, the quadrennial defense review, all were unanimous in saying that this is something that is essential to having a sea-based nuclear deterrence is something that we must move forward on, but we can't allow cost to consume every other aspect of the Navy's budget and frankly put pressure on the rest of the Pentagon. Secretary Lynn, in your opening comments you talked about the end strength changes post-2015. Again, when I first came to Congress in 2007, that was one of Secretary Gates' first initiatives, which was to expand the end strength for the Army and the Marines. You alluded to the fact that we would still end up at a net position stronger than we were in 2007, but you didn't really sort of flesh out the numbers. I was wondering maybe if you could describe that in a little more detail. Obviously, we don't want to find ourselves in a situation where the Guard and Reserves are really forced to do something that they never had to be done in the past and pick up the slack.
I'm going to ask for help from the vices on that. I think the Army, after the 27,000 reduction, will be about 30,000 above what Secretary Gates, is that right?
Well, sir, if you add in the increases to the Guard and Reserve, which are not part of the decrease, in reality will be 38 plus another 9, which is 47 higher than we were when Secretary Gates became Secretary of Defense.
And then the Marine Corps, General Dunford?
Congressman, we've been given a window of 15 to 20,000, but we still have an opportunity to go back to the Secretary of Defense and provide him with the results of our recent force structure review group. So the Commandant's taking a look at the comprehensive capabilities and capacities that we will need, and he feels confident he'll have a chance to talk to the Secretary about the specific end strength that the Marine Corps will have in the future.
Okay, thank you.
We'll now take about a 15-minute break. We'll get back as quickly as we can. Thank you very much.
As we realize the need to balance the force, I don't want to pay for a whole bunch of people and not have any money for procurement accounts. It allows us to ensure we have a balanced force in the future. So we support this plan and are beginning the analysis right now.
Well, for both of you, what you're saying is reassuring to me for persons serving in the military and military families, conditions-based. In regard to dwell time, the goal has been 3-to-1 for active components, 5-to-1 for reserve components. Is this going to be affected by the potential of a drawdown?
I can't tell you that right now because I don't know what demand is going to be, but we feel that one of the reasons we would go back to the Secretary is if we couldn't guarantee our force a minimum dwell time of 1 to 2 when these drawdowns began. And 1 to 2 is critical for us, 1 to 4 for the reserve components. Ideally, we would like to get to something higher than that, but our red line is 1 to 2.
Congressman, similarly, our assumption is that no drawdown would take place until our commitments are reduced. We are now approaching a 1 to 2 deployment to dwell across the Marine Corps, and the expectation is that we would not draw down again unless our requirements are adjusted to be able to maintain at least that 1 to 2 deployment to dwell.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kissel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would also like to add in my congratulations to you and looking forward to working with you on this committee once again. Mr. Secretary and all our guests, thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. Mr. Secretary, one of the things that was alluded to earlier was the procurement savings legislation that we passed, which I thought was great bipartisan legislation with good legislation. How is the implementation of that legislation going? What savings how do we see yet, perhaps? How will that play into the savings we're looking for? And is any of the savings that we estimated would come from that legislation included in what we're talking about here?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Kissel. The thrust, I think, of the legislation and the thrust of our acquisition reform efforts are, one, to establish stability of requirements, not to continually change the requirements, but to establish a baseline and move forward on that, spiral in additional capabilities later if necessary. Second, maintain an adherence to cost and schedule, not have an unbalanced approach where you're only looking for more performance. And then third, to use independent costing as a brake on the system. We are implementing all three of those. I think we're quite far along on all three. In terms of savings, I think it's too early to say, because it takes a while to push these all the way through all of the programs, and where you will see savings is hopefully what you would see is that instead of having cost overruns and schedule delays, we would hit the program milestones as they were laid out. So in many ways it's less cost savings and more cost avoidance. You wouldn't have the case that we've had in the past where you have on average 20 to 30% cost overruns after milestone decisions. Now, we haven't had very many milestone decisions since we put in place the legislation that you took place, so I think we're going to have to measure that and come back to you over the course of the next couple of years.
Thank you, sir, and I think it is important in that communication that we've been talking about and several of my colleagues today. I'm not going to restate that, but it is a concern to a lot of us that we do communicate, and some of the decisions that are being made as we perhaps might need to revisit those because of a change in whatever. We need that communication in a way other than just hearing about it from whatever source might be. We need to hear from the way it's supposed to be. General Breedlove, one specific situation that I read about yesterday, and the name of the UAV platform escapes me right now, but it seems like something stare that the Air Force is wanting to implement a new platform, and the article in the paper indicated there was a lot of problems here, and this seems like maybe a good example of the kind of program that we could be talking about here, where something may be running into trouble. Just wondering, what the thoughts are on that program, how we're going forward with it, perhaps why we're going forward with it if it's having these issues.
Congressman, thank you for that question and the ability to clean up what I think may have been some early and not exactly correct information. That program is called Gorgon Stare. It is a program which allows our ISR forces to look at a larger portion of the battlefield and to be able to bring information to our soldiers and Marines on the ground that they need about a much bigger piece of their battle space. Our current systems, as you know, we like to talk about them as having a very narrow field of view, and it makes it tougher to support the ground troops with some of those. This particular wide area surveillance system, early in its development, because it was a pretty good leap forward in technology, was having some trouble with keeping the coordinates and the positions that we wanted to watch. It was having some troubles with those. And a leaked early report talked about those troubles. 3 things were identified in the program that needed to be fixed. All 3 of those are very close to fixed or fixed now, and the program is quite frankly performing better, and we expect and hope to field it soon, early in the summer, maybe into the theater in order to bring that capability to our soldiers and Marines on the ground.
Thank you, sir, because it's so important to keep that capacity there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service and your testimony. There are many things I would like to cover in a very limited time, but I know that the chairman is going to be insistent on keeping us to 5 minutes. I want to sort of identify myself with the comments of my colleagues, Mr. Aiken, Mr. Forbes, and the frustration in not getting information, in not being consulted, not being part of the process of shaping, arming, equipping, recruiting, retaining the armed forces as we're charged to do by the Constitution. And I have grave concerns about some of the cuts. General Dunford and I have had conversations about the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. I have great concerns that we've got a program here where the requirement has been identified for many, many, many years, going back to where I was much younger, had hair, was brown, and I was in uniform, and we started putting what we then called the AAA into the FITIP, into the POM, and this is back in the 80s. And so now we have this cancellation, and I, like many of my colleagues, and I expect you'll hear from my Marine colleagues here about their concern over that. But in my remaining 3 minutes and 47 seconds, I want to talk about end strength and the force structure that goes with it. I believe, along with many experts, including the fine folks who formed the Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, Messrs. Hadley and Perry and their teams, that we should not be looking at reducing the end strength of the Marine Corps and the Army. I've been a member of this panel now for going on 9 years, and I watched the debate and the struggle as we took the size of the Army and the Marine Corps and year by year worked to build that end strength as we were putting enormous pressure on the reserve component in ways that had never been envisioned. The Minnesota National Guard has been called up again and again. The Red Bulls served the longest combat tour of any unit in the armed forces continuously in Iraq. They're back again and back again, and I am horrified at the prospect of drawing down that end strength and assume the force structure that goes with it. And I'm afraid that we're doing that as a cost-saving measure. And I assume that the assumption is that if you have fewer Marines and soldiers, you need less equipment and therefore less cost. I think that's a poor strategy. I'm very, very concerned about that. But if you are going to draw down, then by golly, we need to know in some detail what that force structure is going to be and how you're going to equip that force structure. I'd like to think that I heard part of the answer to my colleague Mr. Wilson's question about end strength, that conditions based, and we were going to look at that. This process is a little bit unwieldy, as you know, in drawing down and building up end strength, particularly in building it up. If we accelerate a drawdown, and I'm not sure when exactly that started, I heard part of that question, then we're going to be in a position where we've got an end strength that's back slightly above, but close to where we started. I think we're looking at an end strength for the Marines in this proposal of around 180-some thousand. We were at about 175,000 when this started. We're kind of back where we started. Army a little bit bigger, than when we started with fighting in Iraq, but considerably smaller than where it is today. And you gentlemen know how hard it is to build that back up and get the force structure that goes with it. So I guess I'm looking for some reassurance that somehow you now, in a way we haven't had, maybe ever, but not in decades, some sense of what the requirement's going to be for our soldiers and Marines in places that we can think about now, but where we're not deployed. I'm a little reluctant here to suggest some areas in geography, but we know that there are tough things going on in Yemen, there are tough things going on in sub-Saharan Africa. The al-Qaeda threat has not gone away. I assume you agree with that we're still at war with Islamist extremists, jihadists. How, in 30 seconds, anybody, how in the world can you tell me you think we don't need this size of an active Army or Marine Corps? Anybody?
Congressman, I can tell you in the case of the Marine Corps that we actually began our force structure review group back in August, so it predated the efficiencies exercise. And in our case, we're taking a hard look at the actual operational requirements. This was not a drill to draw down the Marine Corps. It was a drill to examine what we believe to be future Marine Corps requirements and to ensure we had balanced capability across the Marine Underground Task Force. So we wanted to make sure we had a balance between the numbers of people that we had across the MAGTF, as well as you pointed out, as well as how to properly equip them. And I can assure you that the recommendations that General Amos will make to the Secretary of Defense are made based on the capabilities he believes the Marine Corps needs to have in his best assessment of what the organizational construct for the Marine Corps of the future ought to be.
Okay, I'm out of time, and so I'm going to yield back, except to say we'll be looking at that very closely, because I'm fully ready to challenge that assumption. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kritz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of quick questions. Secretary Lynn, I'm looking through some of the savings that have been identified, and it's one of the things that popped out. It says many of the efficiency savings announced are from consolidation of IT systems. But in your testimony, you said that the Assistant Secretary for Network and Information Integration has been eliminated. Now, is that two separate jobs, or does this Assistant Secretary not have purview over the IT consolidation of IT systems? I'm just trying to figure out how that works.
It's a good question, Congressman. The Assistant Secretary position has been eliminated. The Chief Information Officer, however, has not. And that individual used to be dual-hatted, and the problem we found with that is that it diffused their responsibility, diffused their focus. They were in the old job, they were focused on buying radios, command and control, a whole series of things. We have moved those acquisition functions to where they belong, we think, which is the Undersecretary for Acquisition. We are asking the CIO now to focus on information technology, focus on how do we interact in this cyber world that we find ourselves in. And so Terry Takai, who is our Chief Information Officer, will in fact be leading that effort in a strengthened CIO office.
Okay. Well, I'm going to hit on a subject that's been talked about a little bit here. It's the EFV vehicle. And we've been talking about, I guess, the minimum distance that's being talked about from shore is going to be about 12 nautical miles. And on a good day, the AAV goes, what, maybe 8 knots? So how long does that mean that once the Marines drop in the water, it's going to take them to get to shore? I don't know how to do the math here.
Congressman, it would take a little over an hour.
Now, is there a maximum time that you...
That speed in 12 knots. In other words, it would be about an hour and 30 minutes if you were at 12 nautical miles and you're going 8 knots.
It'd be an hour and a half.
That's correct.
Now, do you have a target of how long you want the Marines bouncing around in the water before you hit the shore?
We do, Congressman. We think that much more than an hour significantly degrades the Marines' capability to fight.
So we still do have a need for the EFV, and we've sunk about, what is it, $3.5 billion into research development going into this. And what the Secretary is telling this committee is that, well, we're just going to move on. We're going to upgrade the AAV to meet the current needs until we figure out what to do next. Is that correct?
Congressman, we're really going to do two things. We are going to upgrade the current AAV with a service life extension. but we're going to very quickly seek to get a new amphibious vehicle, and we believe we can significantly exceed the normal procurement timelines associated with a new vehicle by leveraging some of the acquisition processes that have been used to support Marines that have been forward deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last several years. The MRAP is a good example from an acquisition process perspective of something that was fielded very quickly. So we very much anticipate being able to get a new amphibious vehicle in a much shorter timeline than the traditional 8 to 10 years that it might take.
Okay. One of the things that I heard talk about with the EFV was that it was a flat-bottom vehicle, and with the rise in IEDs that we've hit, that didn't seem to make sense. So I know that the contractors come up with sort of a pasty to put on the bottom once they hit the shore, which I'm a little bit surprised if you can do that in a hostile environment. But the AAV also has a flat bottom. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressman.
Okay. I have 1 minute left, but I wanted to go back to what Mr. Forbes was asking. And the Defense Department has identified about $78 million in savings off the top line. Now, I'm curious of how much of that savings is going to be plugged back in so that the Defense Department can then start providing this committee the audits that have been required by law, or the auditable reports. I'm curious because that allows us to do our job. And what Mr. Forbes was saying, what you've heard from this committee, is we're the ally. We're not the enemy. And we want to be helpful, but we need to know what we're looking to do and how we can be helpful. So has any of that savings been targeted to help provide this committee the information that we need?
The overall efficiencies effort was developed $178 billion in savings. Of that, $100 billion has been reinvested, frankly, primarily in warfighting requirements as opposed to more of the back office functions. And $78 billion was provided for deficit reduction to accomplish a broader administration goal. We still are committed to improving our audit readiness and ultimately getting to auditable financial statements. That's not because we're a commercial organization and it's necessary for things like shareholders. The importance for us of audited financial statements is it improves our management information systems. It improves our ability to track budgetary resources in particular. And so our focus is on doing that, and we do have an upgrade plan to develop that capability.
I would only add, Congressman, that the Army, and I think the other services too, are moving toward that. We've published a common operating environment to make sure that our ERPs can talk and databases can talk, and we can get to a point where we are an audible organization, and we're moving out on that as quickly, I think, as we can.
Thank you. Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I always want to thank those who wear the uniform of this country for their commitment to stand between the malevolent and the free people of the world, and I'm grateful to all of you. Mr. Chairman, as it happens, there's one particular member of this panel this morning that is a dear friend of mine that was a commander of Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, and it seems like every time we hear about him, he has gained another star or some other promotion. In fact, the Air Force seems to be running out of stars where Mr. General Breedlove is concerned, and made him Vice Chief of the Air Force. And I guess I say that partly because I'm very grateful to the man. He took me up in an F-16 some years ago, and we did a 360-degree loop, and have always been grateful that he was at the controls and not me. But I appreciate all of you for being here. I guess with that, my first question would be to the General, after saying nice things. Now we've got to put him on the spot. General, I'm concerned that we have failed to modernize our nuclear arsenal, or at least I think that's been a sort of a continuing failure. I don't want to put it on any one administration. But this administration in particular seems focused on maintaining our present military, our nuclear arsenal, rather than modernizing it. And there's been some savings spoken of, and I understand that the Air Force is planning to develop a new long-range bomber as part of the family of long-range strike platforms. And I'm just wondering if you think that that bomber will be or could be used as a modernization platform for our nuclear arsenal.
Congressman, thank you for your kind remarks and the opportunity to talk to both of these. I'd like to offer that we are upgrading all three of the bombers in our current fleet. The B-1 has done a magnificent job supporting our ground forces in Afghanistan due to upgrades that we have made to that fleet. The B-52, we're currently investing in upgrading communications gear and other pieces that will make it even more viable into the future, and much the same with the B-2. We have an ongoing upgrade program for the B-2, so I'll be happy to have our folks come by and give you more details on those upgrade programs for the existing fleet. For the new aircraft, yes, sir, in the long run, we intend for it to start out conventional but grow into a nuclear capability. And it will have an upgrade effect and a capability into many years beyond our existing programs is the plan.
Well, thank you, sir. I guess, Deputy Secretary Lynn, I sort of posed the question in a little different terms to you. You know, Russia and North Korea and Iran seem focused on modernizing their nuclear arsenals to my great and grave concern. The savings that you spoke of in your written testimony, I think it's about $70 billion. Will any of that be dedicated to modernizing our nuclear arsenal? Or what is your perspective there? Are we to assume that the administration will continue to focus only on maintaining, or can we look to see some of the indications that they've made on modernizing our nuclear forces to be kept and to be focused upon?
We indeed do have plans to modernize all pieces of our nuclear force. The one where new resources have been provided is the one you asked General Breedlove about, which is the bomber. We did shift some of the savings that we developed over the course of the past few months into increasing funding for that bomber. It was, as General Breedlove indicated, its initial focus would be on the conventional mission, but we intend to build in the ability to do the nuclear mission so that we can transition to that role if that's the decision made down the road. The other piece I would add for you is outside of this department, but is in the Department of Energy. It's one of the critical pieces of modernization is we need to modernize the nuclear infrastructure in the Department of Energy, and part of the debate over the START Treaty included an administration commitment to undertake that modernization, and the President has moved resources, and we've been working with the Department of Energy on that. In many ways, that's actually the near-term requirement, and as I said, it's in the Department of Energy, but it's fulfilling one of our requirements, so we're working very closely with them on that.
Well, thank you. That's very encouraging to me, and I certainly recognize the President's commitment on that, and I appreciate your following through. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. As a new member of the committee, it's my first opportunity to participate, and I appreciate, gentlemen, your testimony. The topic today is integral to our committee's work, as is clearly evident by the questions. The proposed budget reductions and efficiency initiatives have the potential to eliminate wasteful spending and allow us for the reinvestment in those critical areas where we need our priorities to be. And I do applaud the Secretary Gates, and all those who worked over the last few months to try to achieve a start at this undertaking. And there's no question that difficult decisions have and will need to be made. However, I think my concerns and the concerns of those in Ohio, who I have the privilege to represent, are that appropriate decisions are made. So in discussing military spending, we have to assess how each proposed change impacts our national security, our military personnel, and our economy, including jobs and our manufacturing base. And I'm interested to hear from today's witnesses a little bit more about how these proposals impact these important priorities. You've certainly given us a good start on those issues. In the coming weeks and months, I'm also interested in working with DOD and the Office of Corrosion Policy and Oversight. Secretary Lynn, you just mentioned to modernize our nuclear infrastructure. Corrosion has an issue to play, is an issue there. Oversight to address corrosion and the impact that it has on our military assets and our strength, and the significant cost savings that it offers us if we address it up front, as demonstrated by the Office of Corrosion Policy and Oversight. It's not a glamorous topic, but I think it's one that is worth our time and attention, especially given the potential savings if we address it in a smart and appropriate way. So as we move forward, my hope is that we will take a balanced and coordinated approach to evaluate cost reduction and military spending levels without sacrificing our core priorities. And if I could, Secretary Lynn, I'd like to just direct a couple of questions to you. The proposed reductions and efficiencies include, as we've heard here, a reduction of the permanent end strength of the active Army and Marine Corps. And one of the concerns I have, and one that I have worked on in the past and introduced legislation to address, is the issue of the stop-loss policy, where the length of our service members' tours of duties have been involuntarily extended. I just ask, we've been able to make some gains in making sure that our soldiers are getting fair compensation for that extended time fighting our wars, but what is the status of the use of stop-loss currently, and what assurances can you give that these proposed reductions won't result in a return to the utilization of stop-loss for our soldiers?
Well, on the first part of the question, we have been aggressively pursuing the members of the service and former members of the service who would be subject to additional compensation based on the legislation that granted them some benefits for having been held up in the stop-loss program. On the second piece, as General Corelli indicated, the Secretary was absolute in his direction to the Army to eliminate the stop-loss program, and the Army is equally resolute in committing themselves to eliminate that. The immediate impact was the increase of the 22,000 temporary increase in the Army end strength to allow the Army a transition period, and we think we are going to, I'll ask General Corelli to comment in a second, but we think we are going to be able to eliminate it in that time frame and then phase those 22,000 out. But I don't think Secretary Gates or the Army leadership has any intention to return to that policy.
I think, as you know, we have not stop-loss for the last year, and our last soldier held up on stop-loss, if my memory serves me correctly, will come off in March of this year. We have no desire to go back to stop-loss, and our Army Force Generation model has personnel aim points that we are implementing and will continue to implement that will allow us to ensure that we avoid getting ourselves in a situation where we would have to use stop-loss again. It provides us some aim points throughout the year for both bringing on soldiers and bringing them off duty that ensures we maximize their time in the Army.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and I want to thank you so much for your service to our nation. As you heard a little bit earlier, the concerns, I think, among committee members go to a very basic level, and that is we have to make decisions about budgeting and make decisions about strategic needs of this nation. And the strategic analysis and information needs to come to us first so that we can make those decisions. The disappointment has been is that information has not been forthcoming, and many times not in a timely fashion so that this committee can make decisions. And as you know, we have a constitutional responsibility to make those decisions. We would rather it be done in partnership with a free flow of information from the service branches, from the Secretary's office. When that doesn't happen, it creates a tremendous difficulty for us to make those tough decisions. We need to understand what the strategic needs are and then say, here's the finite amount of resources we have to get that job done, and then make those priority decisions. So I would encourage you that when we request information, that we're able to get that in a timely manner. It's absolutely unacceptable to get a 30-year shipbuilding plan or a 30-year aviation plan after the point where this body makes decisions. So that absolutely has to happen. It's going to be tough going forward to make those choices, and I know you all have been thoughtful about putting your proposals out there on how we achieve efficiencies. All of us agree the efficiencies need to be there. The concern, too, is lack of detail about that $78 billion and where that will go. We want to make sure, again, that we're meeting the needs. It's great to have the $100 billion in savings and have those rolled back into the Department of Defense. But the question is if you're going to take $78 billion out, where is it coming from, and where is it going then? And I think that's obviously a big, broader issue that we can address at the higher levels here in Congress. But I do want to get to some of the proposals that you put forward as far as initiatives. And General Dunford, I want to go first to you about the EFV. I have some very basic concerns. As you know, the requirements there, we have a very aged AAV. As you know, at the very edge of capability, we have seen some problems with it. And I know you've spoken a little bit about the plan, but the concern here is, what is the plan going forward? We spent $3 billion and have processed through 20 years of development on the EFV, and now we're saying, well, let's change course. It's too expensive. We can't afford it. We can't afford the operation and maintenance. And then the question is the details. How is the AAV going to get us to that next generation of amphibious vehicles? And how are you going to manage the acquisition process? Are you going to compress it? Is it going to be expeditious? The key is it going to have a thorough test and evaluation period? What's the timeliness? And the bottom line is this. If you're going to use the AAV as a bridge to that next generation of vehicle, the question is when is that next generation of vehicle going to be in the water carrying Marines to shore when they have to make an amphibious landing? So I'll start there.
Congressman, thanks. First, I'd like to provide the context within which General Amos made his recommendation to the Secretary. When we looked at all of our reset costs coming out of the current war, and we looked at all of our future requirements, and we looked at the period of time, 2018 to 2025, we found that the EFV alone ate up 50% of our overall procurement dollars and exceeded 100% of how much money we typically spend on the entirety of our ground tactical vehicle fleet. And to put that in some perspective, the EFV program was 573 vehicles, and we've got 43,000 vehicles, 43 to 45,000 vehicles in our fleet today. So it came down to, and on the operation and maintenance side, similar figures. So it came down to, with regard to the EFV, that it was simply unaffordable for us to balance our requirements. The EFV carries 8 infantry battalions. We've got 36 battalions, 27 in the active force and 9 in the reserve forces. Now, we have an overall requirement for 12 battalions to be lifted by some type of armored vehicle in order to meet our war plans. 4 of those vehicles now, we're looking towards what we call a Marine personnel carrier, which will be a new vehicle to address that particular requirement. What we would like to do is look at the totality of our requirement over the next couple of years, to look at a service life extension program for the AAV, to look at moving the Marine personnel carrier earlier in the POM, so that we get that out there and to meet some of those requirements that we have right now today, and to be able to leverage the EFE program, the knowledge that we have gained from the EFE program, as well as the knowledge that we've learned in the development of other programs, to get the new amphibious vehicle there in a much shorter period of time. I can't tell you this afternoon how soon that will be. As I mentioned earlier, the normal acquisition timelines are somewhere between 8 and 10 years. We're very confident sitting down with our acquisition experts and also taking a look at what's available out there in terms of what industry can produce. We're very confident that we can exceed that normal 8 to 10 year acquisition process. We have been working for 2 years on the details of a service life extension program for the assault amphibious vehicle unrelated to this decision, and so we'll have an opportunity to leverage the dialogue we've had with industry about that particular program as well. We're going to roll all this up into a portfolio approach, the new amphibious vehicle, the service life extension program for the AAV, and the Marine personnel carrier. The difference that we will see as we move forward, though, is we're going to use cost as an independent variable as we get the new amphibious vehicle. We know in the aggregate how much we can spend on the totality of our ground tactical vehicle fleet. We'll share that with industry, and so we need all of these 3 programs to together, in conjunction with the other requirements we have across the Marine Air Ground Task Force, to be within what we project to be the resources that we'll have allocated in the future. So that's the general approach that we're taking, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hanabusa. Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you all for your service and your testimony and the diligent work and hard work that you put into this. I just have kind of a simple question I'd like to ask everybody. If you're talking about risk, and we've been talking about canceling these programs, certain programs, cutting down on other programs, leads us to it's within what Admiral Mullen called the risk envelope, the acceptable risk envelope. Tell me, do you think if you got rid, and I'm just going to throw some things out here, we got rid of the F-22, we stopped production of that, that was within the risk envelope. They're going to stop, there's been talk about stopping the F-35 Stovall, that's within the risk envelope. There's been talk about cutting the B-22 Osprey, that's within the risk envelope. You have the EFV, obviously, which has been hit on by, I think, every member here. That's been thought of to be in the risk envelope. I would like to know what the basis for calculating that acceptable risk is for situations that we're unable to respond to because we lack a certain type of equipment, and why that's okay. Does that question make sense? Why is it okay to have that acceptable risk of not being able to respond to a certain threat or do a certain thing? I'm just wondering, probably Mr. Secretary, you first, sir, how do you calculate that risk?
I think from the start of his tenure, Secretary Gates has talked about balancing the force between the near-term threats that we face and the conflicts we're engaged in and the longer-term threats that we might face 5, 10, 15 years from now. And I don't think it's too far to say he thought that the program that he inherited was out of balance and was more focused on longer-term threats, developing what he called exquisite capabilities for niche scenarios, and not focused enough, frankly, on the fights that we're in before in Iraq and right before us, Afghanistan. So the overall thrust of our efforts has been to maintain acceptable risk in those longer-term scenarios, but to frankly reduce the risk in near term. So to shift money to MRAPs, to shift money to ISR, to shift money to UAVs.
Let me be more specific then. You approved, obviously, the LCS. We have two different versions of it now. We have two different LCSs that operates in an area that is supposed to be the war of now. The literal areas within 20 miles of any shoreline. The Marine Corps, I think their last amphibious move to shore from ship was in Lebanon in 2006. It was more of a evacuation peacetime move. I think General Mattis led an actual amphibious assault in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. What I don't understand is how do you say the LCS works within this area and we need it there because of the type of threats that we face, yet we don't need another vehicle that would do the same thing that is not a conventional warfare type vehicle. I mean, if Russia invaded tomorrow and parachuted in, it was like the movie Red Dawn, you wouldn't have the EFV running around, right? But you would use the EFV if you had to hit a shoreline and you had to help some people out, or you had some terrorist threat that you had to hit quickly. How do you marry those two? I'm not understanding I understand your point, but the logic seems to elude me on how those two things can be separated. Something like the LCS and the EFV that both operate, that kind of have the same type of mission and that would operate in the same waters, yet one is cut and one is not. In fact, one is doubled.
We didn't actually double the LCS, but we accelerated the buy. That's fair enough. Let me be clear, the Secretary and the Marine Corps remain committed to the amphibious assault mission. We are not eliminating the amphibious assault mission. What we are changing is the investment approach to that mission. As General Dunford indicated, using the EFV developed a relatively small number of vehicles at a very high cost that consumed the Marine Corps tactical the vehicle budget for longer than a decade and absorbed more than half of its overall procurement costs. So what we're proposing is a different approach that involves a new, cheaper vehicle and upgrading the older vehicles.
So it's,
but it's still commitment to
General
that.
Dunford, it's acceptable risk to not have an answer to that core capability that or that core requirement. It's acceptable risk because it's too expensive. Is it too expensive to have the ability to hit a shore with an EFV type vehicle?
Congressman, I don't think it's too expensive to have that capability, and we're committed to that capability. In our case, we had finite resources, and I think the expectation is that the Marine Corps be relevant across the range of military operations. And so what we were confronted with is a need to balance our investment portfolio across the Marine Air Ground Task Force for operations across the range of military operations, most specifically focused as a crisis response force and readiness. So we view ourselves as taking a different approach to meeting that capability requirement. The vehicle that we were talking about, the EFV, simply took too much money away and, frankly, incurred a significant amount of risk in the rest of our portfolio. And so we were out of balance as a Marine Air Ground Task Force. That's, from a Marine Corps perspective, the situation we're in, and that's what drove the decision to walk away from the EFV and then go back after a new amphibious vehicle that meets the capability that I absolutely share your concern with. And I think the nation should not incur the risk of not having the ability to assure access to the joint force from ship to shore. We remain committed to that. We just believe we can meet that requirement at less cost in the EFV program.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Lynn, I applaud the Defense Department for courageously proposing a reduction of $78 billion from the defense budget growth through 2016 and challenging the services to make better use of their money. This committee and the Congress must, however, play our constitutional role in defining the scope and specifics of these cuts. But it's an admirable initiative, and I do want to commend you for it. As we complete our withdrawal from Iraq and begin to draw down in Afghanistan, the Pentagon will have to share the burden of getting our fiscal house in order, no doubt. And it's refreshing to see Defense Department leadership coming to grips with this new reality and proposing steps, if only baby steps, to adapt to this new reality. Secretary Lynn, defense funding accounted for about 15% of federal budget authority during the mid to 1990s, the mid to late 1990s. Since the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, it has climbed to about 20%. Do you believe, as we end these two wars, that we will be able to meaningfully reduce defense spending while maintaining our capacity to respond to threats, project power, and ensure the security of the United States?
Congressman, I think that the proposal that we're bringing to the committee formally next month as part of the budget process, which involves real growth in the initial few years of the plan while we still expect to be engaged in conflicts, particularly in Afghanistan, and then flattens out in the outer years when we hope we have a substantially reduced commitment in Afghanistan as well as Iraq, is a responsible balance between the need to reduce federal spending to bring the deficit down and the need to maintain absolutely the highest defense capabilities to protect the national security interests of the nation.
Thank you, sir. General Dunford, the Marine Corps and the Department of Defense are insistent that sea-based forcible entry is an essential capability even as you move to shut down the EFV program. The Department has no specific proposal to replace the EFV, and we've spent, what, $3 billion thus far in research and development, and we're at the point now where we can start production of these vessels at a cost that exceeds that which was anticipated many years ago. And the vehicle at this point, I think, has been described by Secretary Gates as being superb, I believe, or exquisite or excellent in its performance. So we would essentially be throwing $3 billion away and starting out with Korean War era vehicles that have been upgraded, if you will, with plans to produce another 21st century fighting vehicle. It just seems that we go this far and then we make a decision to yank a program despite the cost to the taxpayer and perhaps the efficiency of the Marine Corps in carrying out its obligations. That is something that is almost nonsensical. I know it's costing money, but we need these vessels for you to complete your job. Can you tell how much money the Department of Defense would save by canceling the EFV and developing an alternative? And also, when do you plan to present a detailed proposal for an alternative program? And when can we get the information that backs up your decision to stop this project?
General, maybe you could get that information to him on the record, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely. We will get the information in terms of how much there is a cost avoidance aspect of the EFE, and we'll share the details of that information. That money is, again, what we hope to reinvest to address our other requirements. But I would just respond to the Congressman and say we do absolutely share the commitment to a sea-based forcible entry capability. We share the commitment to get a new amphibious vehicle as quickly as possible in the manner that I described earlier. And we'll come back over and we will share with you the details of that. We've just gone out now to begin to discuss with industry what's in the art of the possible. Again, using cost as an independent variable. We'll take that request for proposal and continue to work with industry to meet our requirement.
And we frankly don't have any idea whether or not a newly developed vehicle would cost in excess of what we would pay for these EFVs that are ready to come online at this point.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ridgel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, gentlemen. As a gentleman who's spent a summer becoming a Marine at Parris Island, as did my son and my dad who served at Iwo Jima, it's really a great honor to serve on this committee. Admiral Greenert, given the operational tempo of our Navy and really I think the collision of how we're running our troops and our ships with these budgetary concerns that are coming in, the idea of spending what could be $1 billion to move a carrier to Mayport seems to me to be a severely misplaced priority. And given the other demands, other things that are lacking, it certainly seems to me that it would be critical and much wiser to invest or reinvest that money in more pressing matters, particularly those that affect readiness. So could you concisely give us, the committee, an update on exactly where we are with the prospect of moving a carrier from Norfolk to Mayport?
Thank you very much for the question. We considered that proposal as we considered everything in this budget preparation, and we are convinced that the strategic value of having our carriers dispersed exceeds any risk, if you will, associated to the budget. We stand by the numbers. It's about $580 million cost. We're very comfortable with that number, the cost to move to Mayport. Some of the dredging, some of the early projects, well, really the dredging has gotten started. So We looked again, as I said before, and we stand by that. The risk, when you talk about what are we concerned about in readiness, frankly, more near term, we're concerned about a continuing resolution because of the risk that places on our readiness ships, $4.5 billion alone to our readiness accounts this year.
Admiral, what steps did the Navy take, if any, to examine what could be done in Norfolk to mitigate those risks? I'm convinced, as are some other retired flag officers who I seek counsel from and others, that practical steps could be taken to mitigate that risk and keep the carrier in Norfolk, allowing us to use those funds for more pressing matters.
The issue is not necessarily, well, it isn't the risk in Norfolk, it's the consequences is that we're talking about. To have the consequences of having not having an alternate port in the East Coast, as we have on the West Coast, as we have for East and West Coast for all of our other ship types. The consequences is what is the main issue here, not the risk, if you will, of an event.
My time is short. Mr. Secretary, would you address for us are there any other cuts that you are contemplating with respect to JEFCOM?
Congressman, we're in the final stages of developing the implementation plan. We expect that the overall cut will be, as the Secretary said, in the 50% range. I don't think it's going to vary from that, and we'll provide the detail to you as soon as we've completed that evaluation.
The Chairman, I think, rightly pointed out the pattern of lack of transparency, and I would certainly appreciate, and I think reasonably expect, as would other committee members, that there would be a proactive effort on the Department to communicate with leadership within the communities, and I would certainly appreciate that going forward. Now, finally, with respect to TRICARE and the prospect of increasing those deductibles, it is widely understood when you enlist in the armed services that you're going to get lifetime health benefits. And I think to raise those premiums or to raise the deductible, I think is a breach of trust with those who have served our country. And if we want to change it going forward, that's an entirely that's a different subject, and I think we should do better disclosure to those who are considering a military career to fully explain to them going forward that your benefits might be changed. But I know every person who is enlisted in the military, they did so and they served believing they would get lifetime care. And I would ask the Department to re-examine that and to set that aside as a possible option to address our fiscal problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just address that last point
briefly, please.
We are not, Congressman, moving away from the commitment to lifetime care for retirees. The TRICARE proposal simply would lift the freeze, which I don't think was part of the promise, that they would have fees frozen at the 1995 level. We think the fees should essentially rise with inflation so that you should maintain a constant benefit, but that you shouldn't, if you don't rise with inflation, essentially the benefit improves every year. That we don't think that was part of the commitment, so we're trying to put in place some kind of reasonable inflation measure on those fees, and that is just for working age retirees. It would not affect the active duty force at all.
Full disclosure from the recruiters, please. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank the distinguished panelists here today for their service, for their leadership, and for appearing before this committee. I'd like to express my support and admiration for all our servicemen and women and for their families, serving us so courageously and selflessly forward in a time of war, multiple deployments. It is recognized. Make my pledge for a solemn commitment to protect this cherished way of life. Having said that, I want to appreciate what's been said today, the testimony, the candor, the effort to find savings. This deficit that we have threatens our very way of life, and everything needs to be on the table as we go forward. I'm interested in learning more about the intellectual underpinnings for some of the rationale for the cuts, particularly in relation to vision for our country, strategy, a fully developed strategy of ends, ways, and means, and how that impacts policy decisions, programming, and budgeting. And in particular, my question today is for Mr. Lynn, and it has to do with Joint Forces Command. I'm interested in understanding, in relation to strategy and, in fact, purpose for the original charter for the Joint Forces Command, what's changed over time and the rationale for why the disestablishment? Thank you.
Congressman, this goes back to the Goldwater-Nichols legislation, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which shifted the balance of the military and put more emphasis on joint warfighting capabilities by strengthening the combatant commanders, by putting in place an emphasis on joint doctrine and joint training, by strengthening the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and having the Joint Staff report to him rather than the chiefs as a body. All of those measures were intended to strengthen jointness. One of those measures was after the Goldwater-Nichols era, but a decade later, the Department set up the Joint Forces Command to help implement those purposes. We think the combination of the Goldwater-Nichols efforts as well as the work of the Joint Forces Command has accomplished a lot, and we think that the combatant commands are in a much stronger place than they were 2 decades ago, and we think the services have a much more joint focus than they did 15 years ago. And in that context, we think that we can pursue jointness without the billion-dollar expense of a 4-star command. We are going to retain a portion of that. As I responded to Congressman Riggle, we think about half of those functions will be retained there, but the overhead of a 4-star command, all of the supporting elements, we think we can save those, and we think the leadership can be done by the chairman and the vice chairman and the joint staff. And we still think we will continue down that path of jointness.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to affiliate myself with the remarks that we can restructure our command and control headquarters, we can achieve consolidation. I think this is really the time to think big, to take a look at the way we lay down forces, to take a look at the way we structure our command and control. I think there may be some other alternatives that we can look at. And as we go forward, Mr. Chairman, I would tell you that I'm willing to be part of that effort if the committee was interested in looking at ways for the 21st century, how we can have these to take a look at full spectrum command and control across all the regional combatant commands, and taking a look at the Joint Forces Command and figuring out what's the best way that we can protect this cherished way of life in a manner that's consistent with a republic. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and you'll be given that opportunity. Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Secretary Lynn and distinguished members of the panel. I just want to say it is an absolute honor to be here serving on this committee. It truly is the culmination of an American dream. When I consider the fact that my father was a soldier in World War II, that my mother served 25 years civilian service with the 6th Marine Corps District Headquarters in Atlanta, an older brother who served as a Marine in Vietnam, the 22 years that I had on active duty service, and now my young nephew who is serving as an assignments officer with the Field Artillery Branch at HRC. So as I bring that experience to bear, I want to echo some of the comments that we have talked about the military personnel side and those reductions. Because I recall a time when the Soviet Union collapsed and I was still there in the active duty, and I ended up being a brigade operations officer. And having to go out and not being able to qualify some of our soldiers except for the weaponeer, that simulation system, or not having the repair parts to be able to keep our howitzer systems up and operational. So as we go forward, I want to make sure that as we talk about this military personnel, that we don't go back and do what we did at that time when the Soviet Union collapsed, where we saw the military as a bill payer for some of the other budgetary programs that we want to do, because I think one of the most important things we have to realize that the world right now is a lot more Machiavellian than it is a peaceful world, and we must be able to provide the national security to our people here.
The thing that I look at is what are the second and third order effects. We talk about the effects on the National Guard. We talked about the effects on the reserve forces. You know, we look and see that now we're starting to see a lot of stress on our men and women in uniform with the countless amounts of deployments they're doing, 4 and 5 deployments. I want to make sure that as we go forward and we talk about the end strength of our fighting forces, that we really are sitting down and looking at the emerging threats and doing a threat-based assessment and analysis so we don't find ourselves as we did going into Iraq in 2003, where we didn't have the right type of equipment, where we didn't have a force that was ready for those long continued operations. And so I would ask, Secretary, as we looked at these personnel reductions, that we have the time to bring in some of the combatant commanders to really look at what are the emerging threats in some of these theaters of operation. We see what's happening in North Korea. We understand what's going on in Somalia and Yemen. Things are not as well as they could be in Afghanistan. We have a threat there in Pakistan. If you look south of our border in Mexico, it's starting to look a lot like Iraq and Afghanistan with beheadings and mass graves and things of that nature, roadside bombs. So, you know, the world is still a dangerous place. So what manner did we use as an assessment or analysis to come up with these reductions to the Army and to the Marine Corps, because we do need those fighting forces to be viable as they are our land combat and maritime combat force?
Congressman, I have 8 years of experience in the department building programs and budgets prior to my 2 years here. In those 10 years, the involvement of the combatant commanders in the building of a budget is unique in, I think, the way Secretary Gates has led this. He had repeated meetings through the course of the summer and the fall to evaluate all of the proposals with all of the leadership. And the Pentagon leadership is the normal practice. Usually the chiefs and the service secretaries, the OSD representatives are around the table. The combatant commanders are frankly usually brought in for just a meeting and told what the budget is, and they go back out and do their jobs. In this case, they were brought in for repeated meetings, repeated discussions. They were a part of the process. So I think the Secretary's understanding of the risks is fully informed by their recommendations. With regard to the force structure changes, I would take you back to, I think, the phrase that General Corelli used, that the proposals we have are conditions-based. Okay. They are, frankly, at the back end of the planning period, and that was intentional, both to allow time for planning, but also to allow time for the expected reductions in Afghanistan and Iraq to take place. Assuming those do, we think that this is acceptable risk, but as I said, conditions-based. If the conditions are different than that, we will have to reevaluate, and for just the reasons that you said. We do not want to have inadequate force to meet the threats that we might face.
Okay, so in other words, we have built-in flexibility.
Absolutely.
Very well. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Secretary Lynn, as you know, I represent Hawaii, and each one of you have your services represented in Hawaii, and we all believe that Hawaii is very critical, especially in the Far East arena. Now, having said that, an integral part of our success in Hawaii has been our civilian workforce. And in reading Secretary Gates' statement, as well as some of yours, there's mentions of cutting in personnel. And I assume part of it is meant to be military personnel, and part of it is meant to be civilian personnel. I'd like to know how you are making the distinction between when you say cuts or freezes, and you talk about it in terms of savings in TRICARE, for example. How is it that you're making the distinction as to which part of this workforce shall be cut? And in addition to that, somebody's going to have to do that work. So I assume that part of this is also looking at outsourcing of that work. And I'd like to know how that decision is being made as to how much of it will be kept in terms of a civilian personnel within the military, and how much of it you would be outsourcing.
With regard to outsourcing, we actually think we have oversteered in that regard, in that There are certainly valid purposes and valid roles in outsourcing, but we think in some cases we have gone too far. We think in the acquisition workforce we frankly outsource too much of our expertise, and we need to bring more of it back in-house, and we are endeavoring to do that. And even though, as you indicated, we have a, I guess I'd call it a soft freeze, we have made an exception for those acquisition increases. We also think in terms of staff support to headquarters and other office functions, we have relied too heavily on outsourcing, and that's the reason for the Secretary has directed that those staff augmentees be reduced by 10% per year over the next 3 years. So we are still conscious we could not, frankly, do the nation's business without contractors. So this is not at all an attack on contractors, but we think, as I said, we have oversteered, and we are now trying to correct the rudder a bit.
So if you can tell me very simply, what are the areas, you're saying in acquisition areas, you're assuming that we would probably bring them back in-house versus outsourcing it, but when you speak, for example, of staff augmentation, what exactly are those functions, and are they intended to be frozen, never filled, cut? How do you look at that?
They're intended to be cut. And what I mean by those are people, for example, who work for private contractors but come to work every day in the Pentagon, would be an example of the kind of augmentee we're trying to reduce. We are just trying to reduce the size of the overall headquarters as an efficiency measure, and in particular we think that the growth over the last decade of private contract support in that particular role has been too great, and we're cutting that back.
How does it impact each state? Like, for example, my state. How would you, when you start to cut or augment, whichever way you're going to do it in terms of acquisition or whatever, how are you going to face that decision in each state? Is there going to be some kind of a uniform policy?
Well, we're not really doing it state by state. We're doing it organization by organization. So the heaviest, you would feel the impact where you have headquarters. So, I mean, in Hawaii there are several headquarters.
Right.
They will see some private contractor reductions here. Of course, I mentioned the Pentagon see some reductions here as well.
Are we ever going to see, is there any plans to augment the workforces like in headquarters, like in Hawaii?
Admiral Greener?
Yeah. Congressman, as you know, Navy's got a pretty big footprint in Hawaii. So if I may, I'll speak a little bit to it. First, in the military footprint, we found that our ships weren't properly manned due to some initiatives we put out earlier. And so we have a lot of destroyers and cruisers. We will be increasing manning in our destroyers and cruisers. When you take the net effect to the fleet in Hawaii, there's a net increase of about 300 military personnel. Looking at civilian personnel, civilian workers, if you will, government civilian workers, obviously Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard is important to us, and we've increased manning there and joint basing as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Lynn, of the $78 billion in reductions, $14 billion, or approximately 20%, is listed as economic assumptions and other. What are those economic assumptions, and what's the breakdown of other?
The economic assumptions are changes in inflation rates, changes in pay rates. That, in other words, what it essentially means is that when you make those changes, and in this case they're reductions, you can buy the same program for fewer dollars.
Those are the economic assumptions?
Yes, that's right.
What is the other?
The other is just all the proposals that are too small to list. We'll provide those when we provide the budget.
So we can get a detailed breakdown of all of those and the economic assumptions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if I could ask a further question. General Breedlove, and Mr. Franks talked about this a little bit. I'd also like the information on the B-1, the B-52, and the B-2 on those upgrades, if you would. And as we talk about this new bomber, what capabilities will that bomber have that the upgraded B-1, B-52, B-2 don't have?
Sir, thank you for the question. We will get on your calendar and bring by the discussion of the 3 existing bomber aircraft. The new aircraft we envision to bring up the capabilities to today's standards in many ways. One of the cost savings approaches we have to this bomber is to not lean forward into technology that's not proven, but bring our aircraft up to the current day standards. For instance, our existing bomber fleet, the stealth capability and technology is 15 to 18 years old. We've done a lot of work in the F-22 and the JSF that tells us we can do that better. So the new bomber will have better stealth capability, but not making leaps forward that we can't count on. And I could walk through the systems of the airplane, the avionics, the ISR capabilities. It's all the same story. We have had years of improvement in those capabilities since we built the F-22, the JSF, the B-52, et cetera, and we will bring this new bomber up to today's standards of capabilities.
General, if I may follow up with that, if we're going to spend the money to upgrade, again, the B-1s, why wouldn't we put that technology into the upgrades of the current fleet? And, you know, that...
And, sir, in some cases, that's exactly what we're going to do. But an aircraft like the B-52 was never built to be stealthy.
Yes,
you cannot bring that to that aircraft. So to the degree that we can bring today's technologies to these existing platforms, we are doing that, and that's part of what we'll bring to your office, sir, and to Congressman Frank's office and discuss with him.
And one further question on that. What is the anticipated cost of the new bomber?
That, sir, is not fleshed out totally yet. We are trying to drive to a number that will allow us to buy a fleet that can address the numbers and types of threats around the world that we face. As you know, sir, the fleet size of the B-2 has challenged a very dedicated group of aviators and maintainers, and our distinct goal in this aircraft is to control the cost so that we can buy a fleet that makes us operationally relevant around the world and around the target set.
One final question, if I may, General. I represent Warner Robins Air Force Base, and there were $3 billion approximately in savings and changes to the logistics of the operations of the depots. Could you go through a breakdown of that?
I can give you an overall read, and then I'll try to hit a few of the specific examples. We are not taking those savings in people. They are in processes. What we're trying to do is adopt more processes like our civil competitors, bring leaner, what I would call leaner stocking and supply practices so that we do not have money tied up in excess stock and supply. And those are examples. And again, be happy to come by and talk about a list of those if you'd like.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to acknowledge some of the comments that have been made prior to me about the Department of Defense not being responsive to the Congress of the United States in terms of inquiries. And I want to really second that. And I hope you all can do a better job this year and going forward with working with members of Congress in terms of providing information to inquiries. First of all, I'd love it if somebody could get back to me and to the committee. I'm sure you looked at everything in terms of making reductions, and I think we still have 4 brigade combat teams in Europe forward deployed, and so is there a potential reduction in short-term, long-term, and redeploying those forces back home? Having served with the 1st Armored Division in the United States Army during the Cold War, I certainly saw the need for those forces there then, and of course we had a lot more then, and I question the need for them now. We can certainly demonstrate our support for NATO by doing joint military exercises on a periodic basis, and so I question having permanent U.S. bases there. In South Korea right now, I think we're moving from an unaccompanied tour, our 28,500 personnel that are there, to an accompanied tour 1-year assignments to 3-year assignments and building all the infrastructure associated with that for dependents. Given the tensions on the peninsula right now, I question the need for that and I question the cost for that. And I would like to know if we suspended that, that personnel change and we didn't have to build all the schools, the housing, and everything associated with dependents, what is the cost savings associated with that? Then I certainly want to commend you, Mr. Secretary, on some of the savings that you've done in terms of the Department of Defense being so top-heavy, combining commands, doing away with Joint Forces Command. Having served in the first Gulf War with the United States Marine Corps, transferred over from the Army to the Marine Corps, and then gone back in 2005 to serve in Iraq, I can tell you the culture of the military has changed from when we started Joint Forces Command in terms of accomplishing that critical mission of being able to work together. And we are there now. We certainly need to stay on top of that, but it is time to dismantle that bureaucracy. And I want to commend you. I think the Defense Department is unlike any other agency of government, that it's easy to establish new commands, establish new bureaucracies, and it's hard to dismantle anything. And so, again, I want to commend you for that and certainly support those cost-saving efforts. On the EFV, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, I'm very concerned, having read the Secretary of Defense's comments on the Nunn-McCurdy breach about affirming the requirement of the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, and listening to the testimony today, where it seems like we're trying to massage a savings where I'm not sure that there ought to be one. I'm going, Admiral, I'd like to, if you could give us a report in writing. You talked about how we went from 25 nautical miles to 15 nautical miles out, and how we are able to achieve that without exposing our forces to a higher risk. General Dunford, you mentioned that we were going to do a service life extension program to the EFV, and that you had a lower cost alternative also to the EFV. But it seems like we have a gap in terms of our capabilities as to meeting the requirement, even if we went out, even if 12 nautical miles was acceptable. We don't have that capability now with the AEV. I'm not sure, even with the Service Life Extension Program, you're going to have that capability there. And I think that a lot of the technology, a lot of the costs associated with the development of the EFV anyway, is probably going to be transferred to this supposedly lower cost vehicle, where we didn't have all the startup costs in terms of research and development. So I think that there's a lot of, I think at the end of the day with the EFV question, what we will have is a gap in the requirement. And look, if a gap in the requirement is acceptable as a cost savings measure, then tell us that. Because really that's at the end of the day what I'm hearing, that we will take a risk in not meeting the requirement in order to save money, because I think the Department of Defense feels that having forced entry requirement is not all that significant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Thank you for being here today, for giving as many as members of the committee who stayed an opportunity to ask their questions. Just one final closing comment. I think you probably sense the frustration of many of the members on the committee for their feeling of lack of communication. I know we have the hearings. I know you present things to us from time to time, like, you know, we had the update on that $78 billion that we hadn't planned on. It just seems to me that if we work closer, we do not want to be confrontational. We want to be supportive. Every member of this committee is strongly supportive of the armed services. But we get the feeling that sometimes decisions are handed to us as a fait accompli, and we're irrelevant. And, you know, we all have big egos up here, or we wouldn't be here. That's not what I really mean. But it is important to give us the opportunity to do our job. And we want to work together to make that happen. So if you can carry that message back, you're going to hear a lot of it until we feel like we are being brought into the process. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just respond to your last.
Sure.
I very much appreciate what you said. I did get the flavor of the comments and the breadth of them. I will say I think the Department recognizes that not all wisdom is south of the Potomac River, and that Congress has a very important role to play and very much value added. And I've heard the examples of the F-117 and UAVs, and Congress has often been right in these debates. So I take your comments seriously, and we'll endeavor to work with the committee, and we very much appreciate the committee's support.
Thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned.